Hi everybody, it's Mr. Kruger. We're here to talk about the Cold War today. I know this is a new thing we're trying, so I want you to follow along carefully. If you need to stop and rewind or go back or pause something to get the notes, that's fine. But make sure that you get all the notes filled in before we have our next class, okay? Alright, thanks. Here we go. Let's get started on the Cold War. Alright, let's talk about some background to the Cold War. First of all, the U.S. and Soviet Union emerged from World War II as the world's two superpowers. Now, when we say superpowers, we're not talking about laser vision or the ability to fly. We're talking about countries who have extreme military strength, also political influence that others seem to follow. Okay, so for the United States, a lot of the countries following them included Britain and France and other democratic powers, and for the USSR rather, it was a lot of countries in Eastern Europe that were having difficulty after the war that looked to the Soviet Union for leadership. Now, obviously, these two superpowers have differences in their economic and political policies. All right. Remember, the Soviet Union is a communist nation. The United States and Western Europe are democratic capitalist nations. These differences are going to lead to big tensions throughout the Cold War. After the war, Stalin was concerned about the encroachment of capitalism on the USSR. So he decided that he wanted to have a buffer zone of friendly communist governments to prevent any future attacks from Western nations like he had seen from Hitler and the Axis powers during World War II. He did this by making sure that Eastern European nations became communist after the war, and as a result of this, Europe was divided by a term coined by Winston Churchill, an Iron Curtain. Okay? When we say an Iron Curtain, we're not talking about a physical, actual wall or barrier, but rather an imaginary line that separated the democracies in Western Europe from the communist nations in Eastern Europe. Here you see a cartoon of the imaginary Iron Curtain. And here you can see a map. All right, so look at the lighter gray countries over here are your democratic Western nations. You see West Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Belgium, etc. All right, Italy was one that was susceptible to communism but did become a friendly Western nation. And then all these darker gray nations, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., all communist nations sympathetic to the USSR. Let's talk about the beginning. All right, so as we talked about, the USSR and the United States had different political and economic beliefs. The United States was democratic and capitalist. The communist Soviet Union was obviously a big change, a big difference from the United States. On your notes, you have some different a chart reminding you of the differences between communist and democratic capitalist countries. These differences, as I said, are going to cause huge tensions between these superpowers. All right, so why is it called a Cold War? A Cold War means that there was never actually a direct armed confrontation between the Soviets and the Americans or Western democracies. They will engage in some foreign battles and what we call proxy wars, but we'll get to that in another video. Stalin set up his satellite nations. You see them here in the pink section of the map, all right? And these were all the countries that were pro-Soviet. The Western powers were kind of afraid of this growing popularity of communism, and soon they took a few different actions to stop this from going any further. And we'll talk about those actions right now. The first one we're going to talk about is the Truman Doctrine. Remember, Harry Truman was the president of the United States at the end of World War II, all right? And so when Stalin decided he was going to put pressure on Greece and Turkey to try and add them to his list of satellite nations, this kind of threatened the United States and the Western democracies, and so they decided to take action. Truman issued an economic and military aid program that was designed to help nations resist Soviet aggression. Remember that countries tend to fall to Soviet communism when they have economic struggles, so we sent them economic and military aid to prevent this. All right, and this is all based on the theory of containment. Containment is a big vocab word here, guys, so make sure you know what this means. You're highly responsible for that. All right, it means limiting the the amount of communist countries to where they had already been in Europe. They were not going to allow any new communist nations. Again, the United States pledged they were not going to allow any further expansion of communism, and they would resist it anywhere in the world. And this is what's going to get us into some of our proxy wars that I mentioned a moment ago. So, in this case of Greece and Turkey, the United States sent them military and economic aid, and that was helping them, designed to help them resist the threat of communism, and did successfully. In 1948, the United States furthered their efforts to stop the spread or prevent the spread of communism by offering some aid to Europe. All right. After the war, Europe's economy was in shambles. Remember, there was huge devastation caused by the war, and so since these countries were in economic turmoil, they were highly at risk for the spread of communism. So what the United States did was create a financial aid program that helped Western Europe rebuild their economy. They also offered this aid to Eastern Europe, but obviously Stalin wouldn't allow that because he feared that this would stop the spread of communism, which he wanted to further, and as a result, he did not want these Eastern European nations to also be aligned with the United States. So as a result, he forbade the Eastern European nations from accepting the aid from the United States. Here's a political cartoon. You can see Stalin here. You got the hammer and sickle as a symbol of the communist Soviet Union. This is Stalin. You can recognize his mustache. A little Marshall Plan is the basketball, hoping to score a goal into European recovery, and obviously Stalin not wanting that to happen, trying to block it. Okay, so you see this political cartoon, very popular one from the time. All right, let's talk about the division of Germany. We kind of mentioned this when we talked about the end of the war, but we're going to go in a little bit more detail here. All right, remember that Germany had been divided into 4 zones after the war. All right, the United States, France, and Britain had gotten 3 zones, and Russia had gotten the Eastern Zone. Okay, in 1948, the 3 Allied zones of the British, French, and Americans all combined their zones into one huge democratic area called Western Germany. The Soviets were afraid of a strong Germany. Remember, Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. They were afraid that if Germany was all capitalist, it would threaten their security, their stability, and the security and stability of their communist allies. So they refused to give up the eastern section of Germany for fear that it would become democratic capitalist. So after this, there are 2 Germanys. You have the democratic Western Germany and the Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany. Germany would be a huge area of Cold War tensions. Remember, again, these 2 nations never getting directly involved in war, but this is going to be an area where they come pretty close a few different times. Within the Russian zone was the city of Berlin. Berlin itself was divided as well, okay, into 4 different sections. You have a Great Britain, France, and the United States, combining their sections just like they had done in Western Germany, and again, Stalin keeping his section separate. So you see the map, these 3 sections all combined, and then this is the Soviet section. These would later be divided by a wall, the Berlin Wall, that would formally divide these sections. This would not take place till after the death of Stalin, but it was a huge area of contention between the 2 nations, and the differences on either side of this wall were huge, but we'll learn more about that later. Even though Berlin was divided, all right, the city itself was located deep within the eastern part of Germany. This is the part controlled by the Soviets. So Berlin is right here, okay? So it was kind of a strange situation that you had democratic capitalism in the western portion of the country, communism in the eastern portion of the country, and within that communist portion you had a democratic capitalist city that took place for a number of years. All right, in 1948, the Soviets decided that they were going to try and force the Allies out of Berlin by closing all the roads that led into West Berlin and allowed them to get supplies from the democratic capitalists in Western Germany. The idea was here that if they cut them off, they would be forced to join East Berlin, and then they would rid the city of democratic capitalism altogether. However, instead of using force and fighting a direct conflict here with the Soviets, the United States and the Western powers decided to airlift food over the borders and the blockades that the Soviets had set up, and were able to drop supplies and food to the people living in West Berlin, and this lasted for 11 months. So this was quite a lengthy thing, but in the end, the Soviets ended their blockade of West Berlin, and the city remained divided between democratic capitalism and communism. All right, in the end, we end up with a divided Germany. In 1949, West Germany officially becomes an independent country, no longer being overseen by the British, American, and French, and East Germany remains under Soviet control. Let's talk about the military alliances during this time, okay? We have a strong division between communism and capitalism amongst the countries of Europe in the 1940s and early 1950s. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is set up, NATO. This still exists today, although it has grown expansively since the creation in 1949. The original members, United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, and a few other smaller Western European countries. Remember, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so it's largely European countries and the United States and Canada. They pledged to support each other if any other member nation was attacked, just like we talked about with alliances during the World Wars. They said, I got your back. If anybody attacks you, they're attacking me, all right? It's a situation that hopes to prevent war by having people support you. On the opposite side, we had the Warsaw Pact. In 1955, the communist nations of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union decide to form their own alliance and say that they will cooperate with military cooperation if any of their countries are also attacked. Last but not least, let's talk about the arms race. All right, we're talking about arms. Again, we're not talking about those things hanging down from your shoulders. We're talking about weapons. All right, don't forget that the U.S. had developed the most powerful bomb ever seen by man during World War II, and the devastation that was caused when they dropped it on Japan really threatened a lot of different powers. So the Soviets, in turn, developed their own atomic bomb in 1949. Other countries like Britain and China will develop their own. All right, and for 40 years, the Soviet Union and the United States spend a lot of their resources developing more and more powerful weapons, building up stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and trying to assure that the other will not attack for fear of the revenge that will come upon them if they do. Okay, we call this term mutually assured destruction. You might want to write that down, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. All right, we'll get into that more a little bit later. But the idea was that if I have more weapons than you, or you have as many weapons as I do, that neither one of us will be willing to attack because we don't know what the other will do. We don't want to risk the attack coming back on us, and so neither one of us will attack, so we just keep large stockpiles of weapons to prevent that from happening. Okay, this obviously is going to raise tensions when two different countries that have huge differences like this have great numbers of powerful weapons. Obviously everyone is going to be nervous about this, and as a result of this, a lot of people around the world fear that if anything were to ever break out between these two nations, it would become an all-out nuclear conflict and would destroy the world. It kind of gripped America and the Soviet Union and a lot of the rest of the world, this paranoia of an all-out nuclear war and the devastation that it would cause. Okay, guys, so that's it for today. That's going to be our intro to the Cold War. I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture, and if you have any questions, write them on your notes. Make sure that you ask them when we are in class next time. Okay? Have a great afternoon and a great tomorrow.